In 2013, my life as an artist changed overnight. It all happened when I published a series of sculptures of my first love and I on the internet. You can see one of the sculptures here, and you might get a sense of who's the angel. After a year of work, I released it on my website quietly and went to bed quite contentedly. And in the morning I woke up, and the images had gone completely viral on the internet. They were plastered everywhere on social media, and before I knew it, I was being contacted by newspapers and television networks to make documentaries, and science journals and art journals, right down to the Guinness Book of Records. It really was a profound moment in my life. And it turns out that within a year, this series of images was seen over 100 million times around the world. Now, the thing about this work is, it's tiny. So tiny, in fact, that it's invisible to the human eye. It's about 100 microns, or 1/10 of a millimeter in height. Here you can get a sense of this work in relation to the eye of a needle. It really is extremely tiny. Let me try and put this in perspective for you. You know those days when you're sitting at home and the sky is clear and the sun is setting, and you suddenly see a beam of light bursting through the window, and you draw closer to the beam of light, and suddenly you realize that the air isn't empty, but there are thousands of tiny particles darting around in the air. This sculpture is the size of one of those particles. Now, the interesting thing is that this isn't necessarily the smallest structure to ever be created. In actual fact, university departments around the world have been creating microstructures of this size in the areas of medical research and material science for many years. So what is it about this tiny structure that resonated so loudly with society? What is it about this structure that makes it art? The glue joining science and art is emotion, empathy. And empathy comes in the form of narrative and story. And so I'm going to tell you the story behind this work. It all started in my teenage years when I went traveling and I fell head over heels in love with the most beautiful young woman in the world. First love. And we had this amazing year together of emotion and experience and adventure. It really was a proper first love experience. But fate had a different plan for us, and I needed to go back to South Africa to start my engineering degree, and so we were pulled apart in a flood of tears. And time heals, and in that time in history there was no internet or social media, and so we disappeared into each other's minds as this beautiful, distant memory of first love. 26 years later, by another twist of fate, we came back together, and I'll never forget that moment where we fell into each other's arms, having not spoken, and fell immediately back in love together. Can you imagine marrying your first love at the age of 50? So coming back to the sculpture, the artwork, you can see it here in relation to the head of an ant. The art is the emotional scale, the heart, the soul, the gut, the love story. And the science is the actual size of the work, the relationship of this work to the physical universe. And I want to explore that relationship to the physical universe a little bit more deeply. This work was created with the help of physicists and scientists from the Weizmann Institute and from the Karlsruhe Institute, using the world's most advanced nanotechnology equipment. It was put together, it was fabricated using this exotic quantum effect called two-photon lithography. And a photon is the smallest particle of light. To put this in perspective, an atom is the equivalent of a planet in relation to a photon. And each building block on this sculpture is made from 2 photons. So imagine that in order to create this work, we needed all of human evolution to come before us, to reach this pinnacle of science, to allow for this to happen. It couldn't have been created at any other time in history. And because of that evolutionary effect, it actually involves all of you, and me, and all of us, and all of our ancestors that came before us. Because slowly, over millions of years, we constructed concept after concept after concept to finally arrive at the point that enabled something of this nature to be made. Now, you might be imagining that I'm saying that this particular nanosculpture required all of science. But could it be that this applies to any form of art? What is it you see here? I'll tell you what you see. This is the moment of transformation in human history. It happened 50,000 years ago in a cave in Borneo. And up until that point, we were animals. We were eating and hunting and sleeping and mating, animals. And suddenly, in a moment of epiphany, a single ancestor took her hands and scooped some ash out of the fire. She looked at the ash and mixed it with a few other elements in her cave and created a paint that she used to create this image of the bull on her cave wall. Now, let's think of the recipe behind this paint for a moment. It required ash, and ash required us to already have mastered the miracle of fire. It required animal fat, and animal fat involved us having already created hunting tools and cooking utensils. And it required red ochre, which points to our early foray into mining and gathering materials. Really, the paint here is a work of contemporary science of the time and reflects the absolute pinnacle of human thinking at the time. But it's not just the paint. Here, this artist is expressing emotional content. She's expressing empathy. She's showing us her relationship with animals, her relationship with the environment, her observational ability. And she's left a marker, a waypoint for us in human history. And imagine to leave a marker like that, what was involved. I mean, she could have just taken the ash and painted a bull on the wall, and a week later it would have disappeared. But no, it turns out she created a recipe that is absorbed into the limestone cave walls, and it lasted for 50,000 years. This artist had the soul of somebody who wanted to communicate with the future. So jumping forward 50,000 years to another nanosculpture of my wife and first love, Psyche, this time in relation to a human hair. I want to share with you that it's quite interesting what happens. I often show this sculpture to people, and the scientists look at it and go, oh, that's an amazing piece of art. And the contemporary art world often look at it and go, well, that's lovely, but it's a work of science. Why is it that these two disciplines are so binary in their thinking? Why is it that they see it in such a black and white kind of way? Why is it that these disciplines can't see art and science as one? And so I show people the sculpture. I've actually got it here, and often after a talk I'll walk out and people will tap me on the shoulder and go, can I see it? And they'll look at it to the light. And the first reaction is always, my goodness, that's amazing. That's incredible. My mind is blown. The only thing is, they can't really see anything. All they can see is a speck. Somehow the science generates an emotional scale, which is really fascinating. Even my father had a really weird reaction. My father, who's been a businessman his whole life, kind of looked at the sculpture and went, "My son, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you for creating the smallest human form in the world. But who's going to buy something they can't even see? Maybe you should start selling microscopes." I want to jump to another example of a work that I've made. This one isn't nano in scale. It's about that size. It's made of bronze. And this uses transformational geometry, and so it translates the abstract into the literal and the figurative through the reflection in the cylinder. And to create this work requires billions, if not trillions, of calculations. But there's something else about the work. That's the science. You know, for me, growing up in South Africa, I remember long days in the bushveld staring into this beautiful water hole and observing the tadpoles and the frogs. And I ended up building this amazing relationship with the frogs. It turns out they're the sweetest creatures. And I actually built relationships with these creatures. That's how I felt as a child. And so this sculpture is a portrait of my friend. It's a portrait of my childhood. And it turns out that this dear friend is endangered, terribly endangered at the moment by a fungus called chytrid, which is putting all amphibians around the world at threat. And so this is a tribute to my friend and the danger my friend is in. Here's another one. This work is in the Science Center in Singapore. And it's of enormous scale, 5 meters. And the amazing team at the museum came to me and they wanted to create something that would inspire the younger generation into creativity through science and mathematics. And we pondered it for a while, and eventually I went to my mother, who has been in mime all of her life. And I took her to a scanning studio, and I said to her, "Mom, put your hands in such a way that you remember the feeling of holding your child." And she did it. And we captured the hand in enormous details. And now I stand at the sculpture in the museum, and I see almost 1 million young children a year coming through and being inspired and held by my mother's hands. And it touches my soul to see that science being so connected to the emotional content. So where does that leave us right here, right now, today? A cave wall is one thing. Cave paintings are amazing. But when last were any of you in a cave? It turns out that when we were a cave-dwelling species, it was completely relevant for younger generations to see these images on the walls and be inspired. But the art history is very different to the art of now. Artists now have a responsibility to communicate with the emotional content and emotional state of the time. And in order to do that, it has to engage with modern science and technology. When I look at this image, I feel anxious, and I'm sure you all do too. We don't know what's right, what's wrong. We're living in such complex technological times. But the question we should be asking ourselves is, what is the cave wall of today? Today it's an iPhone. Tomorrow it's artificial intelligence and deep fake and gene editing. These are times where we no longer know the moral and ethical boundaries of our science. And so I want to end with this message. Art is the thing that will add that layer of empathy to our modern science. It is more important now than ever before that artists and scientists come together. And it's that togetherness which will bring the empathy needed for us to navigate these ethical complexities of our time. If we as a species are to last another 50,000 years, it is essential that empathy and science are bonded, just like they were 50,000 years ago on that cave wall in Borneo. Thank you.